Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this special Lunch and Learn lecture. My name is Jillian LeClaire, your Alumni Engagement Officer here at Florida Tech, and I'm joined by my colleague Cindy Berger, who is our Director of Alumni Marketing Communications, will be moderating today's talk. In our continued effort to offer our alumni with meaningful online programming this year, I'm so pleased to partner with Florida Tech faculty member, Dr. Mark Bush, to provide this lecture for you on the climate tipping point in the Amazon. Before we begin, I have a couple housekeeping rules for you guys. The lecture will be about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. And if you think of some questions during the lecture and think you might forget, feel free to type it in the chat box and Dr. Bush will get to them at the end. Also, please leave your microphone on mute throughout the duration of the lecture to prevent any audio feedback. We all know what that echo sounds like and it's not fun, so please leave your microphone on mute. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Bush or never had him as a professor while you were here on campus, he is a professor of biology, ocean engineering, and marine sciences for the Institute of Global Ecology at Florida Tech. He has more than 30 years experience in working on the biogeography and paleoecology of tropical systems. His current research focuses on using paleoecology to look at all aspects of South and Central American ecology in the Quaternary Period, which is the last 1.8 million years. That's a big period to research. He serves as the editor for the Journal of Biogeography and on the editorial board of the Holocene and Frontiers and Ecology and Evolution. He has published over 150 papers on tropical ecology and climate change and 2 books. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bush.
Okay, thanks, Jillian. I'm going to share screen so you can see the presentation and we'll get going. So the Amazon has been in the news recently because of all the fires down there, and they're very concerning. But I want to sort of put them in perspective of long-term climate change and also of the possibility that we're going to approach what's called a tipping point in the Amazon. The picture here is 2 of the postdocs who work with me on these projects. One in the foreground is actually based at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and the one who's hidden was a Florida Tech postdoc, and they were raising a core from a Brazilian lake, and this is just before COVID hit, and you can see a fire in the background. National Geographic funded us to go down and collect these sedimentary records so we could put the modern fire problem in the Amazon into a sort of long-term perspective. And this is how we get our data, is to get these sedimentary records and then we analyze the microfossils in them. So Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre put out a paper a couple of years ago, and this is a quote from it. "We believe that negative synergies between deforestation, climate change, and widespread use of fire indicate a tipping point for the Amazon system to flip to non-forest ecosystems in eastern, southern, and central Amazonia at 20 to 25% deforestation." So we are already very close to 20% deforestation in the Amazon basin. And today what I want to do is to discuss why I think that they are right, but also to paint a little bit of a picture about why a simple 20 to 25% deforestation is being a bit simplistic. So my outline today is I'm going to talk a bit about the threats and the tipping points, what they are, what they mean ecologically. I'm going to take a historical view of an Andean series of tipping points, and then I'm going to make that connection between the Andes and the Amazon to show why those things are actually related to what happens in Amazonia. And then we're going to talk about the proximity of a tipping point in Amazonia today and just how close are we to reaching one. So let's just refresh ourselves about why the Amazon is so important to us. It's the largest single pool of terrestrial biodiversity on the planet. It's a continental area that is so vast you can fit the continental US into it, basically. And we're talking about having that transition from the main forest system that inhabits it today to savanna. In so doing, we would change the amount of moisture that gets liberated into the atmosphere, because the forests are sort of, we think of them sometimes as a series of lungs. I don't actually like that analogy, but you can think of them as exhaling very wet breath. And so if you've got all that moisture not being liberated into the atmosphere, it's going to change precipitation patterns over the entire hemisphere. It's also a huge pool of sequestered carbon. And if we were to release that pool of carbon, then we would be really jump starting climate change far beyond what it is today. And then lastly, the Amazon's home to about 8 million people today. And so clearly some of those are ranchers and settlers, others are the indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest, and their future is tied up to whether this would go through some kind of tipping point or not. So what is a tipping point in this context? This is when we have a steady pressure on a system, and it's probably temperature change is the thing which we think of most, because we've got anthropogenic warming taking place. And so as we increase that temperature, that's a fairly linear kind of change that we've got going on. But what we might see is a very non-linear response. And so that's what the little cartoon shows here, is that you can keep pushing and pushing a system, and it's basically appears to be stable until it sort of fails. And you get this catastrophic change into a new stable state. And so here we've got rainforest, which has been stable in that basin for at least 2 million years. And we're coming close to a point where we could push it into becoming a savanna, which it hasn't been at all in that historical time. And so life isn't adapted to it. We'd see a mass extinction associated with this. Because I'm a paleoecologist and I think about long time series, I want to bring that perspective to this talk today. And these are data from the Antarctic. And the top panel shows changes in carbon dioxide through time. And you've probably seen this data set before from the Epoca ice cores. And then the bottom series here is temperature inferred from deuterium measured in the ice. And I don't want to get into the technical details of how they do that, but for today's purposes, what I want to point out is we're looking at 800,000 years here on this x-axis, and that in this bottom panel, the y-axis, 9 degrees Celsius, is the length of this red arrow. So as we're looking at today, which is over on this extreme, we're in an interglacial. This is our current interglacial. We call it MIS1, Marine Isotope Stage 1. And it's about 9 degrees warmer than a glacial. If we look back through time, we go back 125,000 years, we come back to MIS 5e, Marine Isotope Stage 5e. And you can see that one's a little bit warmer than today. And there's just a guide here to show where these peaks are. And you can see Marine Isotope Stage 7, which is the previous interglacial, was about the same as today. MIS 9, a little bit warmer. MIS 11, and then we have nothing, reaching modern temperatures going back for another 2 million years. So we've got two peaks here, which are really of interest to us because they are warmer, distinctly warmer than modern. If we add in anthropogenic warming, we move up by about 1 degree Celsius. And so this is basically where we are today. And we see here that we're now pretty much the same as MIS 7, is within error. But MIS 5e and MIS 9, so this one at 125,000 years ago and this one at about 300,000 years ago, are distinctly warmer than today by probably about 2 degrees Celsius. And we can use that as a natural laboratory to see something about our future. So these two interglacials, I'm going to be talking about them. So if you hear me say MIS 5e, MIS 9, just have in the back of your mind, that's 2 degrees, 1 to 2 degrees warmer than modern. So for the last 10,000 years, we've actually had incredibly stable climate. We warmed coming out of the Ice Age. So it warmed the Atlantic. That led to a continental warming. It's promoted very stable climates for us. And in that stability, and key to this, that stability, we've developed agriculture and civilizations. And as we think about climate change going into the future, it's not just warming a climate. That's bad enough. But think of it as destabilization of a climate. That's really what we're doing. And it's this destabilization then which would threaten agricultural success and civilizations. The first part of the talk, I want to talk about the high Andes. Lake Titicaca is the highest great lake in the world. It lies at 3,800 meters, which is almost 14,000 feet elevation. Every night it's below freezing there. There's not much seasonal difference in temperature, and so there's a wet season and a dry season, but every night it gets below freezing, but the lake never freezes. It's big enough to have its own microclimate around it. And what's going to become apparent as we talk about it is this. You can see that the lake here feeds into a river. You can just see it here. This is the Desaguadero, which flows down here to Lake Pupo, which we'll talk about later in the talk. So Lake Titicaca is probably 5 million years old. It's a rift lake. It was formed as the Andes rose up out of the Amazon plain. And in 2001, the GLAD 800 drill rig, which is 9 shipping containers put together, and they're half filled with styrofoam, half with water, and a full-size drilling rig stands above them, and there's a hole in the middle of the rig, and so that's what they drill through. And this was out on Lake Titicaca for 3 months solid drilling, and it raised a sediment core, which was 250 meters in length, roughly. And so that's about 800 feet of mud. And that represented 370,000 years. We were part of that consortium, and we did the follow-up research to look at the change in that mud from this drilling. Part of what we found during that study was our collaborators did very detailed bathymetric analyses, and they could even identify things like wave cut shorelines down deep in the lake, and they could also tell how old they were. And from that, they established that the modern outline here is Lake Titicaca, but this outline here in blue is how big the lake was when it was at MIS 5e. Remember, 1 to 2 degrees warmer than modern. So the effect of that warming, in part, was to shrink Lake Titicaca by 85%. It lowered the lake level by 120 meters, and you ended up with this much smaller lake. We'll come back to that. We analyzed the fossil pollen from this lake, and I don't want to get too much into the details here, but these are daisies and sunflowers over here. We've got, I should just say, we've got time on this axis here. So it goes from 360,000 years ago at the base up towards modern. The gray bars here represent where we have the interglacials. So here's our modern Holocene, MIS 1. Here's the MIS 5e, 1 to 2 degrees warmer. MIS 7, about the same as today. MIS 9, 1 to 2 degrees warmer than modern. Then we come over to these, Amaranthaceae. These are sort of saltworts. These are commonly salt bushes or salt plants you find in sort of salty settings very often. And sure enough, if we look at them, we have 2 giant spikes of occurrence of these things. And in today's setting here around Titicaca, the vegetation would often look something like this. It would be sort of these grasslands and little polylepis woodlands. So here's the polylepis here, and we see that today. We go back to these settings back here, and we have no polylepis here. We have very little, this is grass, this green. We have very little grass. Everything is this salt bush, and so it probably looked a lot like this landscape down here. Clearly, this is a very different system than this one which we have today. So let's sort of try and walk through a cartoon of what I think might be going on. in today's setting, we have Lake Titicaca in an interandean plateau. We have what's called Puna grassland around it with a few scattered polylepis trees in that grassland. And then on the outer flank of the Andes, facing away to the Amazon basin, we have Andean forest. There's a little bit of fire in the system today, which is almost all set by humans. And that's in the grasslands, it's not in the forest. Okay, so that's the modern system. Let's think about what it would have been like in the Ice Age. And that's this panel over here. Lake Titicaca was actually deeper by about 100 meters. It was a larger lake at that time. And the Andean forest is being pushed down the flank of the Andes towards the lowlands by the cooling. The ice masses have grown. They don't quite reach the lake, but they're on the highlands. As we warm that system up, the first thing we see around the lake is polylepis, this little woodland tree, moves up and grows around the lake. And we have a richer grassland as well. It's a more productive landscape as it starts to warm up. The Andean forest moves up this outer slope, and we can see the pollen from that blowing up over the ridge here, but it never gets enough of it to be seen to be growing around the lake. If we have a linear system, we would continue that warming, and that Andean forest would move up and it would grow around the lake. This is what it would look like with 1 to 2 degrees of warming, assuming that it's just being controlled by temperature. So we would then expect all the pollen around the lake to reflect this Andean forest. But that's not what happened. We had the warming trend continued, but instead of having that steady progression up the slope, what we get is the lake suddenly contracts. There's fire in the system. You get a salt marsh developed here. The lake actually becomes salty. We can tell that from the algae that grew there. And this system has flipped from a forest moving upslope into this much more xeric landscape here. And it flips between 1 and 1.5 degrees above modern. So that gives us a tipping point in this system where we stop seeing a linear change and we flip to one of these sudden non-linear changes within 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So going back to my little cartoon of things, what we have is our external forcing of orbital change. It warms the Atlantic. It provides warming onto the continent. That drives drying to some extent on the continent, which causes reduced humidity and increased evaporation over the lake, which lowers the lake level. We hit a tipping point that causes more drying, and we get into a positive feedback, or I should say a negative feedback mechanism in this sense, of becoming drier and drier and driving that lake level down. So on Lake Titicaca, this is my sort of cartoon explaining what I think is going on. We have a fairly linear temperature trend through here, but we get to a critical point where moisture availability is declining because you've got more evaporation. So it may actually be raining more, but you've got more evaporation, so the net moisture availability is actually falling. And biomass increases initially until you get to this sort of critical point where the moisture really falls. Biomass is driven down at the same time that fire frequency increases. And so this is our tipping point in the system. Today, I've labeled the MIS stages up here with these arrows. So today we sit here. We're within 1 degree of reaching that tipping point. MIS 9 and MIS 5e both exceeded the tipping point. That's why this repeated twice in the past. MIS 7, which is very similar to today, never made it. So we actually have, 4 examples here of approaching this tipping point and 2 that actually exceeded. So what's the linkage? Why does this happen? And why does this tell us anything about what happens in the Amazon? And the answer to that comes from, where does this moisture come from that feeds Lake Titicaca? And it comes out of the Atlantic. Even though we're sitting over on this side of the continent, over well towards the west in the Andes, all the moisture that falls in the Andes comes out of the Atlantic, not the Pacific. And so the Atlantic moisture comes sweeping in a thing called the South American low-level jet. As it comes across, it's deflected by the Andes and it funnels south. And then most of that moisture will actually end up going out close to Rio de Janeiro, out into the South Atlantic. But in the meantime, there's strong convective cells set up here in a thing called the South American summer monsoon, and that lifts this moisture up and into Lake Titicaca here. So we've got seasonality playing a role here. June, July, August is our summertime, and that's when the northern Amazon is wet. December, January, February is when the southern Amazon becomes strongly convective and wet, and that's when we get all this moisture being lifted up into the Andes here. So our wintertime is their wet season up in the high Andes in the south here. But just bear in mind, all that moisture is entrained and is coming out of the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm going to skip over this slide. So as we think about this, it's also important to realize that moisture coming out of the Atlantic doesn't stay in the atmosphere the entire time. A lot of it is going to fall out as precipitation over the eastern Amazon. It'll get taken up by the trees, retranspired back up into the atmosphere, and it's estimated that water will cycle from the clouds down through the trees, back up into the clouds 5, maybe even 7 times, passing across the Amazon basin. And so this cycling of moisture then is absolutely determined by the presence of forest in the Amazon basin. If you if you don't have the forest here, you will dry out this section, and that will mean that you have very much less moisture getting through to the western Amazon, which means very much less moisture to be lifted into the Andes. So a paper by Wang et al. Looked at this recycled moisture and asked the question, how important is it as a fraction of the rain falling across the Amazon basin? And if you're in the very eastern part of the Amazon basin, all of your moisture is coming directly out of the Atlantic, and so the vegetation isn't that important to you in terms of your moisture source. And as you can see, by the time you get across to the western Amazon here and into sort of the Andean portion, the yellow here is 0.6 to 0.8 at peak. So that's saying that about 80% of the moisture is coming out of this recycled moisture. So if you were to interrupt that flow here in the eastern Amazon, it would have the strongest impact would be here in the Andes and the western Amazon. We're interested in this area, that this happens to be the point where you've got the highest amount of this recycled moisture as a proportion of the falling moisture. And the altiplano is just very slightly to the south. It overlaps this oval to here. Some of you probably saw headlines like that there's been 3 droughts of the century in a decade in the Amazon basin. And this is, each of these is associated with changes in Atlantic sea surface temperature. And it's interesting to look at these and see that the pattern of drought across the Amazon was different with each of these. So 2005 and 2015 were both El Nino events. 2010 was just an anomaly in the sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic. But what we see here is that in 2005 is a sort of central western Amazon that has the peak of drying. In 2010 is the northwestern Amazon that has the peak of drying, with another hotspot down here in the southeast. In 2015, it's the entire eastern side of the Amazon that gets lit up. And this was the probably the second biggest El Nino that we've seen on record, this 2015 El Nino event. And it really did have this huge impact on Eastern Amazonia. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. So the immediate impact of these droughts was, as you can see here, it lowered the river levels in the Amazon. This was a problem for navigation, for trade, for all kinds of things. But it was also a huge problem in the Andes, because bear in mind, the moisture that is flowing across the Amazon, if it's interrupted by a drought, is not making it to the Andes. On top of that, we have anthropogenic warming of the planet. So this is a long sort of 60-year trend or so, looking at temperatures over the Amazon basin. And in that time, you can see that this mean, which is from 1961 to 1990, is the basis of that mean. We've gone up from that mean about 1 degree Celsius already. That's a lot. Right? In the Amazon, the difference between a glacial and an interglacial is not the 9 degrees that we saw in the Antarctic. The difference between a glacial and an interglacial in the Amazon is about 4 degrees. So we have added that, is almost the equivalent of a quarter of the heating that you get from going from a glacial to an interglacial. We've gone up that ramp in the space of about 30 years. That's phenomenally fast heating. So we started off by looking at those peaks of MIS5e and MIS9, and that was the highest temperatures of the last probably 6 million years, certainly the last 2 million years. And now we're romping up close to those temperatures in the space of decades, not millennia. In ecology, we like to think about systems and how resilient they are. And this is a sort of common cartoon that we use of a ball rolling around in a trough. And if you're in a very resilient system, the ball will roll in this trough and it won't jump out into the adjacent valley. Okay? So here, if you've got a drought, and you push this ball and the drought pushes the ball, it'll push it up the slope a little bit and then it'll roll back. In other words, the system recovers. That's a resilient system. Down here, we see a little graphic showing a system state. And so this is, again, it's just saying if you stress the system, and that's the stress on the system, it bounces back quickly, right? The ball rolls back into place fairly quickly. And consequently, as we look at the amount of variability that we have in the system through time, there's not much of it. It remains a stable system. So that's what we call a highly resilient ecological system. As we change that system and reduce its resilience, which we commonly do by stressing a system, the cartoon changes. And so this ridge that was holding the ball in place is flattened out. And now, if we knock this ball, it doesn't take a lot to knock it down into this other state down here. So this is the tipping point. This is our forest. This is our forest in a really healthy system when it's not close to any kind of ecological limit, is very resilient. As we get close to a limit for its capability of surviving as a forest, we flatten out this landscape and make it easier for this ball to roll into a savanna state down here. So some of the things that we can look for when we're in this state still is this, when we stress the system, how long does it take to recover? And how much variance is there in the system? So our variance, we expect to increase as we get towards low resilience. It's an early warning sign, if you like, that our resilience is changing. We start to see more flickering in the system. We see more amplitude in variance. We also see that the system takes longer to recover. It's what's called critical slowing down. And so either of these are sort of warning signs that we're getting close to something which is less resilient. Going back to these droughts now, we've got 3 of these droughts of a century occurring in a decade. That we could think of as being a warning sign at the macro level of this big system level, that the system is varying more than it used to. It's flickering. Right? So we've seen that. We can see that in the Amazon. Let me make that connection back up to the Andes again. So notice that in 2015 is the only time when we get the entire Eastern Amazon lit up with drought like this. Remember what I said about the rainfall moving across convective cycles and then the cycles coming off the forest itself? What happens, do you think, if you break the cycle here by having a big drought here? It's going to propagate all the way across the basin in terms of reduced moisture availability, right? So here's that cartoon again, just to show you that we're going to talk about this area here in the Altiplano. We've dried out this area here in 2015. We're predicting then that this, because it's so reliant on this evapotranspired moisture coming out of the forest, we ought to see a consequence here. Over on this side, we have Lake Titicaca. Its outlet here is the Rio Desaguadero. There's a sill here. It's a it's a ledge that controls the flow of water out of Lake Titicaca. It's a natural dam that holds the water in Lake Titicaca and prevents it flowing down the Rio Desaguadero. It's only about 2 to 3 meters deep, that sill. Even though the lake is hundreds of meters deep, the sill is only 2 to 3 meters deep. And so if the lake level falls a bit, just a little bit, the Rio Desaguadero dries up or its flow is greatly reduced. And that affects Lake Pupo down here. So this is what happened over Lake Pupo in 2015. So 2013 had been a high stand in Lake Pupo. It had been just full of water. It was actually one of its largest stages it had been in because we'd had a very wet period then. That's part of flickering too. Then we come into the drought of 2015. And as you see this lake here, the darker the color, basically the deeper the water is going to be in the lake. And you can see this lake just evaporating away, leaving a salt pan in its place. And that's what it looked like on the ground. This was the second largest lake in Bolivia, evaporated. It went away. It was it's a lake big enough to have a fishing fleet on it. And here's the fish. So this was a huge disaster for Bolivia, for its fisheries. Right? These high elevation communities here, they rely on farming, they rely on fishing. It's very much agricultural landscape up here. And La Paz, which is right beside these lakes, supports 2 million people. And this is now a water-stressed situation. So this is clearly something which the Bolivian government is very concerned about. So this area then that we've just been talking about and its sensitivity to this, we've just seen it in the context of a natural climate change, albeit one which is being forced anthropogenically by having increased sea surface temperatures, which is what promotes these droughts. But now let's put it into the context of deforestation and land use change in the Amazon basin. And this is a map of the 2019 fires in the Amazon. And I think the orange dots here showed deforestation fires, and the red dots were showing existing fires on agricultural land. So this is both a map of sort of land use and also of deforestation. And just notice what's going to happen here. We're seeing a lot of deforestation in this section of the Amazon. Right? This is the part that is of most concern to me, anyway. If we get deforestation up here that finishes this slice across the Amazon, that would really be devastating to the flow of moisture across here. So long as this area in southern Amazon is the only area that's burning. This is an area which has seen ecosystems sort of come and go in terms of rainforests and savanna in the past. It's less ecologically damaging for this very southern edge to be transformed. By the time you get up into here, this has never been anything but rainforest. And so this is more concerning. But certainly if you're up into this section of the Amazon, you'd be propagating those changes all the way across the basin. So we talked about increased flickering or increased variance in the system at Lake Pupo and so on. Now let's talk a little bit about critical slowing down. When we have those droughts, one of the things that it does is it stresses the trees. And you might think it's the little youngest trees that would be tender and die, but actually they're beneath the canopy. They're protected from the worst effects of the drought by the shade of the canopy above them. The trees which are most susceptible to drought, you can see here, are the tall trees, the ones which would be what are called emergents, coming out of the canopy. Down here, this giant saber tree here. These giant trees that stick up out of the canopy are old, hundreds of years old. Some of them might be as old as 1,000 years, but for the most part, they're going to be sort of 300-400 years old. And they're being disproportionately lost from the system faster than they can be replaced. And so that's part of a critical slowing down. If you think about the capacity of the forest to go back to having these giant emergent trees, it's going to take a long time for another tree to come through from the forest and get to this size. And these trees are hugely important for the diversity that they support. So the critical slowing down then, one manifestation of it is in tree mortality associated with these very strong droughts. In Brazil, we've been seeing an uptick in fire activity and deforestation. We got a lot of news about it last year, less so this year, although the fires are just as bad this year, but because we've been taken up with elections and COVID. But if we go back to 2019, when all that news was being made, we can see that the fires and the deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon were not record-setting, not in the sense that we'd never seen anything like it before. We've seen many more fires. In 2005, we'd seen more deforestation in 2004. But what had happened since then was that the Brazilian government had changed its policies, had put in place measures to try and save the forest, to try and protect it, to try and limit the amount of fire that was used and the amount of new deforestation that was taking place. Bolsonaro came to power, and you've probably heard about his responses to the COVID crisis. He's a lot like Donald Trump in that regard. And he is also a lot like Donald Trump in the sense that he believes that resources should be exploited by people. And so he set about changing the emphasis of the government, not necessarily changing actual written policy, but just stopping the enforcement of existing policies, allowing people to go back into indigenous lands, settlers to move in. It's been, very destructive in some of these areas, and the native people, the indigenous people, have lost that battle almost every time. And so it's not that we've set a new record for fires, it's just changed the trend. The trend had been that we were on decreasing amounts of fire and decreasing deforestation unless you had major droughts like the 2015, 2016 drought, the 2010 drought, or the 2005 droughts. These were all peaks of fire and deforestation, 2005, 2010, 2015. Those are the big peaks in fires. And then we start to see this trend when there was no drought in the Amazon last year, reversing and seeing many more fires. That was what was so disturbing to people about it, this apparent change in policy, moving away from conservation and moving towards increased clearance of the land. So why are we so concerned about fire? Well, the fire will totally transform these systems. Amazonian systems are not have not evolved to deal with fire. A single fire in an Amazonian system will change it from being a carbon sink, where it's absorbing carbon, which is what we want, to a carbon source. It will change it from being something which holds moisture to releases moisture. And biotically, every species of ground nesting bird in the forest is lost to a fire. They won't come back in after those fires. You'll have a different avifauna which will come in, but it's not the sort of unique one that you started with. If you have multiple fires, it just drives the system towards a hotter and drier setting. Now think about what happens if you take the entire eastern flank of or eastern side of the Amazon and you start to convert it to pasture. You break that cycle of moisture moving across the continent. And so this is a human-induced drought in the Andes as opposed to a drought coming from changing sea surface temperature. I just put this in here to show that we know something about the charcoal history and the fire history across the Amazon basin. And we know that these areas only started to burn when we have cultivation moving in. And this is the indigenous people cultivating land sort of 1,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. But they were doing so on a small scale. It was not on the industrial scale that we're seeing today. So these are records taken from particular sort of locations where people are known to have been and so on. This is not a random survey across the Amazon basin in terms of how much fire there was. So this looks like there's a lot of fire in the past, but you have to understand that this was targeted right around where people were living, right beside rivers, right beside lakes. It was not a general condition. My point here is that fire is a uniquely human event within Amazonian systems. So the threat today is deforestation, increased fire, trying to get cattle onto the land. Is horrible agricultural land for the most part. It's really miserable pasture as well. You get about 1 head per hectare in the Amazon, and it won't be sustainable. And so you end up degrading the pasture, and you have to move your cows off, and you have to deforest another section to maintain your stock. So that's one aspect. We've got a lot of mineral exploration going on, some of it legal, some of it illegal in the Amazon today. This down here is an oil terminal on the edge of the Yasuni National Forest in Yasuni National Park in Ecuador. This is the highest biodiversity center in the Amazon basin, and all the time there's a push to open it up to get more oil extracted. That means putting in more service roads. That means more people. If you have more people, you have more hunting. And so the whole system starts to be degraded. This picture over here, I took last summer, or summer before last, I guess now, and it's the shoreline of the Napo River at a place called Zancudo-Cocha. And my background that I'm talking in front of is Lake Zancudo-Cocha, and the photograph I have here was taken in 1988. This photograph was a stark contrast. It was amazing to me. So in 1988, I went to this lake. It took 3 days to get there at that time. It took 3 hours this time. When I went there in 1988, no one lived down here. Not at all. Now you can see you've got cell phone towers. There's a community here. And I'm not arguing that Ecuador shouldn't develop its cell phone structure and have people living in the forest. That's not my point. My point is, it's now so easy to get here. What do people do when they get there? They farm, they hunt, they empty out the forest. This system is being changed from within. And every time we put a road somewhere, we open it up to people, right? And as people move in, they cut down the forest. Look at the forest behind me on my screen there, and then look at this forest. And you can see this is a much smaller forest. It's got big open patches in it here, right? So this means that it's dry. So people have come in here and they're drying out this landscape, even in the wettest part of the Amazon basin, just from what they're doing. When we get deforestation or new occupation in the Amazon, it's very common to get this sort of herringbone effect of an initial road gets driven in, and then all these side roads get driven in off it. And we see this repeated all the way across the tropics. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Brazil or Indonesia. This is just, once you put an access road in there, the land hungry will follow you in and they will open up the landscape. And so that's pretty much what's going on here in Brazil these days. The orange here shows where we've got deforestation. And that deforestation, I said, down here, right on the southern edge, I'm not so worried about that. But as it spreads up here into what I think of as the proper wet Amazon, that to me is much more concerning. If this deforestation spreads across here, which it will, then that is going to dry out the rest of the Amazon basin. This is a rainfall map across Amazonia, modern rainfall map. And you can see that where all that deforestation is taking place is in the yellow here. That's relatively dry in terms of annual precipitation for this area. We have a dry corridor that stretches north here. And this is where I predict there'll be a lot of settlement moving through this corridor, just because it's easier to burn, it's easier to live here than in the blue areas, which is really the ever wet places. But if you allow this yellow section here to be bisected, to bisect the Amazon, you're going to disrupt that moisture flow across Amazonia. And that's why I think, that's what's so concerning about the future, and why I think that Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre were right. This is projected deforestation for 2050 in the Amazon basin. That's only 30 years away. If we have the best case scenario, it doesn't look that much worse than today, perhaps. But this area here is the sort of current limit of where we've got deforestation is close to this yellow today. And this would just move all this deforestation deeper into the Amazon on the southern edge. If this happens like this, I don't predict a tipping point. If this happens, I do. This is business as usual. And this intensity of deforestation through this section here, which dries out this portion of the eastern Amazon, I think would definitely cause a major change towards the west. So here's a recap of where we were with the extreme interglacial tipping point. So this is 1 to 2 degrees warming beyond present. And the time scale for this, it takes thousands of years for this to occur. Right? That's what we've seen before. But this is what I think of as the anthropogenic tipping point. And in this, we've got the external forcing is now greenhouse emissions instead of being orbital change. We now have a warming Atlantic, which we see today. That gives us continental warming, which we see today. Sets up droughts, which we're seeing. And then if you add to that fire and deforestation, the human aspect of this, instead of being a relatively slow thing, this becomes a supercharged system that is changing really quickly. And that's going to drive us towards a new tipping point with spiraling towards drought in this way. So my take-home messages then are, if we look at this purely climatically, we're within 1 to 1.5 degrees C of a climatic tipping point in the Andes. If we have business as usual anthropogenic warming, we've warmed about 1 degree Celsius in the last 30, 40 years. So something in a ballpark of the next 40 to 60 years would take us towards that tipping point anyway. Right? So that will put it as 2060, 2080, something like that. If we have deforestation in the Eastern Amazon, which it looks like we're going to get, it's going to exacerbate that and bring that closer to us. And so I think that if we have fire, that just amplifies this whole thing. It facilitates deforestation. It drives us towards a drier and hotter state. And so I think that we could realistically think about a deforestation climatic-induced Amazonian tipping point, say by 2050, within 20 to 50 years. I think that is absolutely on the cards. So what do you do about it? Well, individual nations, certainly the Amazonian ones, cannot control climate change, global climate change. That's going to take a global commitment. It's something which we don't have a lot of time to do. The US has been failing, it says woefully here, and I think that's probably a pretty good term. It's just disgraceful that we've withdrawn from any kind of international agreement about climate change. And we have to get back on to make that a priority for policy. What we can also do is to encourage the individual nations in Amazonia to set policy to limit deforestation and fire. That shouldn't be us sitting on the margins and sniping at them to say they need to stop burning, but to offer actual incentives, whether it's through carbon sequestration, but not planting eucalyptus kind of carbon sequestration. We want to have maintenance of existing forest and then monetizing that. So we can actually offer them a reward for this to become part of their strategy, because it's in our long-term interest. If we destabilize the hydrological cycle in the Amazon, we will regret it here in terms of our changing hydrology. It will change our capacity to grow food as well. And so we have a vested interest in trying to maintain the Amazon. And with that, I'll stop talking and take any questions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I've got from Charlie, the tipping point appears to have some similarity to what's happening within the IRL. Absolutely. I mean, that's another system with a tipping point in it. That one's induced by phosphate and nitrate. And like all tipping points, you drive it one way and you load the system with phosphate or nitrate, and you'll drive it towards a bacterial system rather than a seagrass-based system in the lagoon. And you actually have to clean up more nitrate and more phosphate than you put into it in the first place to drive it back the other way. It's called a hysteresis or an asymmetry in these things. And so, yes, we've got a lot of work to do in the IRL, and we're very close to a tipping point there too. So from Karen, is the El Nino pattern changing? That's a really difficult one to answer. We think the answer is yes. We think the answer is that the El Ninos are becoming more intense, but they may also be moving into the mid-Pacific. They may be changing how El Ninos form as well as their effect. So the giant El Ninos we had 1982, 83, 97, 98, those gave us tremendous rains over the Pacific coastline of Ecuador and Peru. And the 2015, 2016 one is what's called a Modoki El Nino. And that's set up in the Central Pacific. And it was really a giant event, but it didn't produce the same outcomes. And so I think that we're watching what happens with El Nino and trying to learn from it. And it's really complicated. That's all, all the atmospheric physicists and so on, they don't know truly what's going to happen with that. I think the suspicion is that we're going to have more events like the 2015, 2016 one. And they just manifest a little differently. But basically, if you warm the ocean, you can expect that to be a stronger system. And of course, right now, we've got a La Nina in the Pacific Ocean, and that's part of why we've got such an active hurricane season. When we have a strong La Nina system, we get more hurricanes in the Atlantic. They don't get the tops taken out of them by the jet stream in the same way. And so as we amplify that Pacific system, we can expect it to amplify our hurricane system over here as well. As I recall, the Nature Conservancy Organization focuses on the productive use of lands. It still arranges to protect other options that brings in. Yes. The Nature Conservancy has kind of changed its role. It's not buying up lands anymore, and it's tending to promote finding a maximum resources out of the land at the same time as maintaining conservation value. Are there options that Brazilians can take? There are Brazilian NGOs who are very engaged in all aspects of this, but until you get the government to stand by its own laws and to restrict settlers from just invading the lands of indigenous people, or to restrict people from setting fires, the NGOs can't do much about it. You don't mention population growth. Isn't that the root cause of all our problems here? Yes. I mean, it's more than just population growth. The Brazilian government had a deliberate transmigration policy in the 70s and 80s, where they wanted people to move out onto the frontiers of Peru and Ecuador. They saw Peru as potentially a military threat, and so they wanted to have more people living on that frontier so it would become more definitively Brazilian. So it's not just about a lot of people in Brazil. It's about incentives to have them move into the Amazon forest. You know, is there still going to be a sort of the same charge to colonize the Amazon that we had here in the US in the 1800s? And it's basically, that's the parallel I would draw rather than simply population growth. I don't think that's, population growth, of course, is an issue, but that's not the prime one here. Is there a solution? Yeah. It's political. It's got to be a political solution for this. And it's going to have to take a different government in this country to have any role in it. Let's put it that way. Is human consumption of meat a driver of this deforestation? Absolutely. A lot of the cheapest hamburger comes out of the ranching in the Amazon. And so, yes, trying to source where you get meat from, avoiding rainforest beef would certainly be part of this. But even if you do that, you know, the Chinese market is still going to be there. So it's, you know, what I don't think it's something that we can really control too much. What's the most effective thing we could do as citizens or laypersons? Vote. You mentioned the majority of moisture in the. Okay, so this question is about the ITCZ. So the intertropical convergence zone is essentially a maritime phenomenon, and it's the movement of the ITCZ north and south that brings the rainy season into the Caribbean, and then as it comes south into onto the edge of the southern hemisphere, it brings the moisture to the south. But the actual convection that I'm talking about over Amazonia is sometimes mapped as being the intertropical convergence zone, but it's actually inaccurate. It's separate. And so we should actually think about the ITCZ as being a maritime thing, and the deep cell convection that happens over the Amazon basin is a related phenomenon, but it's a separate phenomenon. And that becomes important. It seems trivial, I know, but it becomes important when you really change climates going into the glacials or interglacials, because those things decouple. And so that's why I'm drawing a distinction there. But commonly you'll see the ITCZ being drawn as this big sort of loop that comes down across the Amazon basin. And to that extent, yes, that's the ITCZ moisture, but I would say actually that's an inaccurate way, being pedantic about it, to map it. Can't help but draw parallels to South Florida's continued effort to expand westward into the Everglades, simply because we can. Yeah, so it's just that encroachment. I mean, we have laws here in place that say you cannot encroach into the water conservation areas that have been set up by the South Florida Water Management District, for example. You can't encroach into Everglades National Park. Those are things which we sort of tend to take for granted, and we get pretty peed off with someone who suddenly went into the Everglades National Park and started to run cattle in there. But that's exactly what's going on in Brazil today. So we have, where they have restrictions such as indigenous lands, those become paper parks. They've got these ranchers going in and deliberately killing off the indigenous people so they can run cattle into those areas. And so it all comes down to legislation and the political will to allow or to stop this stuff. And so until we can get the Bolsonaro regime either replaced or to get them to be more responsive to conservation issues, then we're going to get more news like this. I think that's...
All right, no more questions?
All right, well, thank you everyone for attending and being so engaged.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bush. That was an awesome talk and great questions from our alumni. I wanted to let everybody know that I have recorded this talk and I will be posting it on our alumni website under the events tab by the end of this week. So if you want to watch it again, share it with your colleagues or friends or family, it will be there for you. It's also going to be posted on the Florida Tech YouTube page under our virtual alumni videos playlist. So we're trying to make everything available to you guys and as flexible as possible so you can watch it when it's convenient for you. We also have another virtual event coming up tomorrow. If you or your family members are fans of Harry Potter, we're doing a Halloween themed Harry Potter trivia night. And you can also find that information on our website. And, you know, we're just hard at work over here at the alumni office, coming up with new and fun virtual events that we can provide for you guys. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to email me at jleclerc@fit.edu, and we will keep bringing you great programs like this. So thanks again, Dr. Bush, and thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you. Take care.